Coming to you from the Forge of Freedom studio in the heart of America. A podcast dedicated to preserving freedom and inspiring personal success. Freedom is born and lives through you, the individual, and it dies in the shadows of tyranny. Motivating our listeners to become well-rounded, freedom-minded people with the body of an athlete, the mind of a stoic, and the spirit of a warrior. The tree of liberty lives on through you, the Forge of Freedom. And now here's your host, Alex Ooley.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 67 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I'm joined again by Mike Ooley. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Hey, good morning, Alex.
For those who don't know Mike, Mike is an attorney. He's also a firearms instructor, and he's my father. And today, we're going to talk about flying with firearms and some of the pitfalls and some of the nuances that people need to be familiar with, because it's not exactly intuitive, but we want to try to give people some guidance and some resources about where to look and how they should go about going through the process of flying with a firearm. Because while it may seem daunting at first, it is possible. And once you go through it, at least once, you find out that it's not that big a deal. Although, even though we don't like the TSA, we think the TSA should be abolished. They're a useless organization. They do have some guidance about how to jump through their tyrannical hoops. So with that said, one thing that I think we'll start out with is just a quick story. We noticed, actually Mike saw this story in our local news. For those who don't know, we are in southern Indiana, close to Louisville, Kentucky. So the closest international airport to us is the Louisville International Airport. And there was a story recently about a man from Greenville, Indiana, which is just up the road from us, who had gone to and beyond the security checkpoint with a firearm. So, Mike, you want to say just a little bit about that story before we get into the nuts and bolts of flying with a firearm?
Well, yeah, first of all, we're talking about just a little context here. We're talking about flying within the context of a typical, where you buy your ticket and you go to the airline counter, a commercial airline flight. We're not talking about stuff where you get on a chartered plane or a private plane or that sort of thing. Also, that goes without saying. Also, too, I'll make sure we're going to give you some ideas about our experiences. Keep in mind, there are a gazillion airports out there and a gazillion TSA agents. And I suspect we generally stay in free America. But I suspect people who go through airports like Seattle or New York or New Jersey or Los Angeles could have a very, very different experience than somebody that goes through some of the airports that we go through. Nonetheless, keep in mind, most of these airports, and we're going to talk about potential criminal referrals later, but keep in mind, most of these airports are in rural areas where local prosecutors generally in larger metropolitan areas, city areas, urban areas have a tendency to want to charge people. So to get back to your question about the Greenville incident, or not the Greenville incident, but the incident that occurred over at Louisville. This gentleman evidently had a carry-on bag, and most people your listeners are familiar with going to the TSA checkpoint, and they've got all kinds of machines and people, and I think they have blue uniforms, whatever these TSA people are in. And we have to go through all the charades and fiction of improved security as a result of this government apparatus. Well, this guy did that, and his bag went through the X-ray, or two bags went through the X-ray. This is according to news reports, by the way, just news reports. So this is what I've read. And the TSA agent, evidently in the X-ray machine, does notice a purported firearm, but nothing happens except evidently there's a conversation. Hey, you've got a firearm in there. I don't know what the guy does. The news article, we chuckled about this. The news article, bring that up. What does it say? It says the gentleman, I won't use his name, allegedly took off walking in a secured area. So
yeah, I think maybe I'll read just that portion of the story. It says, according to the arrest report in the case, a firearm was detected in one of his bags at around 6:30 a.m. And when a TSA agent told Van Bree, that's the name of the gentleman from Greenville, it was detected, the suspect reached onto the belt and grabbed his two bags. One of those bags had the firearm inside and was still inside of the x-ray machine. Van Bree then allegedly took off walking into
Yeah.
the secured area.
Yeah.
And a half hour later at 7 a.m., a ground stop was placed on all aircraft. And surveillance showed that Van Bree had boarded Southwest Airlines flight to Las Vegas. So what's interesting is it's characterized like he was the bandit that's trying to get away from a bank robbery.
Yeah.
But then they say he was walking.
Yeah. So yeah, and what's other, and we shouldn't. I don't know what was going on with this gentleman. As I said, I think the vast majority of these cases, I'm not commenting on his, are just simply mistakes. And we're getting our information from a news article, of course. But what's interesting is this is discovered at 6:30 a.m. and it's not until 7 that there's a ground stop placed. And surveillance showed that he had boarded this airline at gate B-17. Well, I don't know how many of your listeners, some of them are familiar with Louisville International Airport. It's not much international about it, but it's a small airport.
Very small.
So I'm not sure what was going on with this security apparatus that the federal government's in charge of, that it would take a half an hour to decide to maybe deboard this plane and go through the process of checking everybody and dealing with this gentleman and his purported breach of security at a checkpoint. So anyway, that's what precipitated our episode today. I read that. And it just goes to show you, I think it supports to a great extent how these concepts of government security are just simply fictions. Obviously, if this guy intended to harm anybody, between 6:30 and 7, he had ample opportunity to do that. Mm-hmm. And the security screening didn't do anything to stop that opportunity.
And maybe that's the topic for a future episode, the effectiveness or the ineffectiveness of the TSA and the sort of charade that it is. There's some information out there, I don't have it at my fingertips, about basically there were some tests to see how effective TSA was, and it was incredible how often prohibited items got through the TSA security checkpoint. So like I said, maybe that's a topic for a future episode, but nevertheless, this is a serious concern, because people oftentimes use the same bags, they use the same gear to travel with that they use to take to the range. And they need to be very careful about traveling with a firearm, because if I don't know if this was a mistake or not with this recent incident in Louisville, but oftentimes people go to that security checkpoint and have a firearm or ammunition by mistake. And we want to avoid that if at all possible, because the civil penalty can be quite severe, and you can be referred for criminal charges, although that's not up to the TSA. The referral is, but whether or not charges are filed are ultimately up to the local prosecutor.
So if you violate this at the TSA checkpoint, what you're facing is it's like $14,950 fine. It's the outside fine. If it's unloaded, it's far less than that. If it's a first offense, it's going to be less than that. But nonetheless, it's a civil penalty, and there's a range for that civil penalty for TSA to exact upon you. Now, there is a mechanism. We won't get into that today, but there is a mechanism where you can appeal these things and go through a process. But the other thing is, as Alex mentioned, keep in mind, you could be, because what the TSA will do, or what they're supposed to do, is call, when they see this firearm, the police are called, the local police generally, or the airport police, and people that have arrest powers, they take control of the firearm, make sure it's unloaded, that sort of thing. But they can also arrest you for this, and the local prosecutor may actually charge you for it. In our experience, that's not happened. We've not had that experience personally. Professionally, that's not happened. So anyway, but you are facing possible criminal issues.
Now, I don't know the current status of this recent incident that we were talking about with Van Bree, but the article says he was arrested and placed under a $10,000 bond, and that he posted bond. So it sounds like he was in fact charged criminally for this, not just a civil fine.
Yeah. So the other thing is too, and one thing I'll mention, Bearing Arms. I don't know if it was Cam Edwards. There was a couple articles in the last 2 or 3 months I've noticed. One of them was Tom Knighton, and the other was Cam Edwards, had mentioned an article about TSA is putting out press releases or information about they're on pace to have a record year for gun I don't know, confiscations is the right word, or gun discoveries at TSA checkpoints all over the country. During the first 3 quarters of this year, they discovered a little over 5,000, I think 5,072 firearms. And if it continues at that pace, it's by my numbers, don't yell at me, but they're on pace to get about a 3% increase in the number of firearms they discover. Now, that may be, I hope, I don't want people to make these mistakes, but probably more people are carrying firearms, so there's more opportunity for that. But we want people, though, not to make this mistake, because then TSA uses that as bad press for us gun owners. And then we hear, once again, other politicians, they use that opportunity to garner power and under the guise of keeping us safe.
These are the sorts of stories that TSA uses to justify their existence.
And also an expansion of their power. And I'll mention this too. This came out of the Bearing Arms article. And like I said, I don't remember if it was Cam Edwards or Tom Knighton. But anyway, evidently in the Western District of Pennsylvania, the U.S. attorney there, at least a year or 2 or 3 ago, and I think there's been renewed interest in this, was somehow going to work to have people's concealed carry permits revoked. Well, of course, the federal U.S. attorney doesn't have authority to revoke a concealed carry permit issued under state law, but he was going to make referrals to the local sheriffs, county sheriffs, hoping they would, this was the plan, this was the thought, make referrals, and maybe the sheriff would, revoke your permit if you made one of these mistakes. And evidently in Pennsylvania, there was some support by the Sheriff's Association, or the president of the Sheriff's Association, saying he thought that was a good idea, and they would maybe sheriffs would consider revocation. I don't think he said that we were going to do it absolutely, but this is the sort of thing, these sorts of articles by TSA give some federal official somewhere, room to stand up and get attention and, talk about, getting more power for the federal government or even the state officials.
But the point of this too is that it's not just the civil fine, it's not just the potential criminal referral. They're trying to use these to bootstrap these violations to impose all of these collateral consequences, like revoking your license to carry a firearm. So these are serious potential implications of violating these TSA rules. So.
Yeah. Can I say something?
Yeah.
I mean, we kind of laugh at shouldn't laugh at TSA. It is a tyrannical organization in my mind, but it is important, though, I think, that people take personal responsibility for their firearms. Yeah. And if you have a firearm in a bag, first of all, we don't advocate off-body carry at all. We think because somebody can take your bag or you can lose control of it. You've got to have absolute security of your firearm at all times. We advocate on-body, and certainly you can't do that at a TSA checkpoint. But if you've kind of lost track mentally of your firearm, that's not a good thing, and you need to work on that. And that's a reflection of what's going on, I think, in the majority of these cases. That's just my opinion, that they're just absolutely, people are in a hurry. They're late to the airport for whatever reason. They carry their firearm in a bag and they forget to take it out. And here we go.
And luckily, in our experience, we've helped people negotiate and sort of navigate these penalties in the past. It's typically ammunition that people forget. There's some loose ammunition in their bag, or they've got a magazine that they forgot about, something like that. That's typically what's going on, but certainly people need to be more aware of the security of their firearm.
Absolutely. Irrespective of, TSA and the federal government, as concealed carry permit holders and people that exercise according to those permits, or if you might be in a constitutional carry state, doesn't matter. For whatever reason, you need to be responsible with your firearm and make sure you have maintained complete 100% security of that and control of it.
So let's get into the nuts and bolts here a little bit about what people need to consider if they're going to fly with a firearm. Of course, like I always do, I will link to the articles and the resources that we mention here in the show notes, so you can come back and refer to some of this information we're talking about, including the news articles. But if somebody's going to fly with a firearm, Mike, what should they do?
Well, first of all, make sure you check state law about firearms. Even some airports in some states, it's illegal to have a firearm at all on the airport premises, perhaps unless you're there just to take a flight. So you may be somebody dropping somebody off. It may not be a permissible area. So you need to check federal law or federal law. You need to check the law in your state with respect to what's going on at the airport. But if you're going to fly with your firearm, there is a TSA webpage where you can look, and it lays out exactly what the TSA thinks the federal regulations say. In usual federal bureaucratic speak, they've taken something that ought to be pretty simple and made it difficult to understand. This guy probably got a promotion, the guy that wrote this, because the bureaucracy has done a good job of making it confusing. With that said, here's kind of what you need to understand, I think. Number one, you need to travel with a firearm that's going to be unloaded. When you go to the airport, what I do generally is I'm going to put my firearm in a hard-sided case. I have a Pelican case here. This is what I use when I travel. It's a Pelican 1170 case, but if you know anything about Pelican cases, they're very good. It's got good locking mechanisms. I have 2 locks on this right now. Remind me to talk about that in a minute. But make sure you have a hard-sided case. Mine identifies me and my phone number on the outside and the inside, and addresses. I don't have the address on the outside, but it's got my phone number in case there's an incident. You need to make sure it's unloaded. And that means I take the magazine out of the firearm. I actually, in addition to having it in that hard case, which has 2 locks on it, I don't know whether you need 2 locks. It needs to be a situation where you can't pry the thing open like a screwdriver or something. I did have somebody tell me, I think it was an airline employee at a particular airport. It was in Florida. I think it was Punta Gorda, actually, said the TSA was rejecting cases that didn't have 2 locks on them if the case had a place for 2 locks. So anyway, that's what I do. I also use one of these cable locks. And the reason I do that is because, it just shows people that the gun is unloaded. It's sort of I just think it's an extra precaution. And it also helps me because I'm a little bit nervous or anxious sometime about making sure. I mean, I quadruple 10 times check everything. But if that's through the gun, and I put it through basically the frame, you can see that the gun's unloaded. There's no magazine. There's no way.
Hold that up there. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just a typical cable lock. It's not typical. This one has a combination lock. I don't like keyed locks. So this is a combination lock. I think at a minimum, it would be a good idea to put a chamber flag, a safety chamber flag in there so people can see and that it's not unloaded. Anytime somebody's going to be potentially looking at your firearms, I think it's a good idea it's a very good idea to use a chamber flag. Yeah. So anyway, in those locks that were on that Pelican case, they are not TSA locks. TSA doesn't need to be looking at your firearm, or nobody should have access to your firearm unless you're there with it. Okay. But this case, what I do then is it's locked up with two locks. It's got this, cable lock on it. And then this gets placed in another piece of baggage, like a suitcase or whatever, that does have a TSA lock on it.
And the cable lock, though, to be clear, is going through the gun.
Yeah, the firearm.
You have the slide open, and you have it up through the magazine well and out the ejection port of the slide. So
that small Pelican case goes into another piece of luggage. So nobody knows after it gets on the little conveyor thing. It doesn't look like it's not a firearms case. It's traveling by itself because I'm talking about carrying a pistol here. So anyway, when you go through that process, usually after you check it in, you need to say, listen, I'd like to declare an unloaded firearm. You need to tell them that immediately to the check-in person at the airline there. And they'll do their little administrative thing with some tags and stickers and all that. Don't walk up there and say, I have a gun. Just say, hey, ma'am, I'd like to go ahead and declare an unloaded firearm.
And they will give you a declaration. It's like
to sign
a tag or a form, and you sign it, and it should go in with the firearm.
Yeah, and make sure that's not the time to go, oh, you know what? I need to make sure it's unloaded. There needs to be no handling of the firearms at all. All that needs to take place at your home or your hotel or wherever before you get there in a safe place. And of course, whenever we're dealing with a firearm, we want to make sure it's pointed in a safe direction. So anyway, a lot of times that gate agent will say, hey, wait around for 5 or 10 minutes because it's never, ever happened to me. But it's possible the TSA would like to look into your hard-sided case where the firearm's at, and then they'll have to get you and look at it or whatever. And that's one of the reasons I put the cable lock through it, because I think it's my absolute conjecture on my part, but that may help the TSA people that are looking at through the X-ray machine know that that's an unloaded firearm. Okay, no magazine in the firearm whatsoever, and the magazine makes me think about the ammunition. It needs to be unloaded. There's some room for interpretation here, but that means not just taking the magazine out of the gun and the magazine still has ammunition in it. It means no ammunition in any of the magazines, obviously in any chamber, but not, no ammunition at all in the magazines.
Now, technically, you can have if the magazine is covered, but we don't
go there. Don't do that.
It's possible within the TSA regulations,
but don't go there.
But don't go there. We're talking about best practices here, not just minimal compliance.
Yeah, and if you want to read what TSA says, where that might be arguably possible, you can go to the TSA website and read that. Keep in mind, though, even what the TSA puts on their website is not necessarily the law, because there are regulations and it's TSA's interpretation. Right. But anyway, don't push that. We're given what we think are best practices. As a matter of fact, a lot of times I don't even carry ammunition, because where I'm going and coming from,
you have ammunition available.
Ammunition, but I don't, I have it stashed in the airport. We have property that allows the ammunition. I don't have to transport the ammunition. So anyway, if you're going to transport ammunition, though, it needs to be carried. I think that TSA says something like a container or boxes that are intended for the transportation of ammunition, something to that effect. But the best practice, I think, is just to carry it in the original manufacturer's. You can see this, the original manufacturer's box. Just put it all in there, carry it in there. I think you can carry it in that box, in the hard-sided case with your firearm. But I would even go one step further and say you might be, if you want to wear a belt and suspenders too, it's probably good to put that even in a separate hard-sided case from the firearm. I know that's one thing, we recommend in other areas as well. So anyway, just make sure it stays in the original quality case, the way it came from the manufacturer.
Yep.
As far as the ammunition is concerned.
Yep. And there is some limit on ammunition. I think it's around 11 pounds, but make sure, like Mike said, that it's stored securely and that the firearm is unloaded. The other thing, too, is that you mentioned that there might be a few minutes delay at the check-in counter. In my experience, and I'm curious about your experience too, because a lot of times we travel separately when we're flying with firearms. There's not usually a huge delay or a huge addition to the check-in process simply because you have a firearm. Has that been your experience, or have you had significant delays?
No, I've had almost no delay.
Yeah.
I've never had a situation where they wanted to look at it, where they wanted to talk to me, nothing whatsoever. But I'm going to caution folks again. We're going through small airports for the most part, and parts of the country where folks are not scared that somebody has a firearm.
Yeah, we often fly from Indiana to Florida, for instance, and that's no big deal because it's a direct flight, and Indiana and Florida are both relatively I should say Kentucky, because we fly out of Louisville a lot of times. Kentucky and Florida are both relatively gun-friendly areas, so we have that benefit, and we don't fly a ton. And I'll link to. I would encourage people to check out an article by Greg Ellifritz, because he's somebody who flies much more than we do, and he's put together an article about some of his experiences flying through places that are less gun-friendly. So definitely encourage people to check that out. But the main point I wanted to make there is that while this may seem daunting, it's not terribly difficult as long as you do your homework ahead of time and you're prepared. You do your preparation at home with plenty of time. Don't rush through this process.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, is just give yourself time so that you can not be in a big hurry to do something, to get caught doing something mistakenly, is what it amounts to. So, I don't think it's a big deal.
But
Obviously when you get to the other end, it stays in the case. You get off the airport property, get to wherever your destination is, and make sure you handle the firearm safely at that juncture.
But another important point too is we've been talking about TSA regulations. The airlines themselves often have a separate set of rules or regulations that they have in place.
Yeah, and that may be. This has been years and years and years ago when Ryan and I don't think you were.
I wasn't
with
yeah.
Ryan is
my brother,
his
other
Alex's
son.
brother, my older son. But we were going to Florida, and he was going to shoot a 3-gun thing, or we were, or whatever. So if you know anything about 3-gun, that means you have 3 guns, 3 different types of guns. You have a pistol, a shotgun, and a rifle. Well, we called the airline the night before about, I don't remember what it was, just to make sure. It was a question with respect to their guidance. And the person told us whatever, I don't remember what it was. I think it was about how many guns you could have in each container, because we were using large Pelican cases for this. And
I think the issue was you couldn't have a handgun and a rifle in the same container.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
So you could put as many rifles in the container as you wanted, but you couldn't put a handgun in with the rifles. Okay, whatever.
Yeah.
That's their policy. It's their airline, their airplane, whatever. Private company. Well, I think we got to the airport and they're like, "Who told you that?" It's kind of thing. So anyway, just make sure you check with the airlines, read their requirements too, because they may be, they're not. If they can't contradict TSA, but there may be additional requirements that the airlines have. So whatever airline you're flying, make sure you check with them is the point.
And I'll link to some of the most common airline web pages with their policies about flying with firearm on their particular airline, so that you have easy access to that. The other thing is, you mentioned you like the combination locks, but if you're going to use a keyed lock, do not keep the key in a place where somebody can easily access it. You are the only person who needs to have access to that key and should have access to that key, because TSA should not be looking through your stuff without you present.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, they're firearms. I mean, obviously, right, because of, once again, the security apparatus, you put TSA locks on your regular luggage so TSA can look at your underwear, I guess, but not your firearm.
But don't put your key or a copy of your key in your checked luggage. You should keep the key with you at all times.
Yeah.
Okay. What else, Mike? What else should people be considering when we talked about the cases a little bit? You want to make sure that they have a nice tight seal, because they can't. You don't want people to be able to get in there with a screwdriver. Pelican makes a great one, and I'll link to their website. They have other great cases.
Yeah, and I suspect, I don't know this, I suspect there's thefts at airports. So sometimes these cases, you buy a new gun and the manufacturer gives you a quote hard case with, at least I think almost all the time does. I'm not aware of getting a soft case, but maybe you do. But those, in my estimation, probably, I'm not talking about federal security. There may or may not be okay for that, for the TSA regs, but we want to have something that's genuinely secure. That's why I use the Pelican stuff. So don't use something cheap that somebody can get into easily and quickly. And I always think about a kid, something happens and, at the airport, the airline handling people, this thing gets in the wrong place or whatever. You don't want anybody to be able to get your firearm. And that's one reason I put the cable on it as well. So just make sure you got a quality case is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. The other thing is that, I mentioned flying on a direct flight. If you're on a flight that has a layover somewhere, a connection, sometimes those get diverted. You have a different connection. Make sure you do not take possession of your firearm in a place where you are not allowed to take possession of a firearm.
Yeah, if you go to New Jersey and, for instance, you're inadvertently, let's say I want to go from Indiana to Florida, and for whatever reason I'm inadvertently diverted to New Jersey, and I have to spend the night there. Well, I'm not going to take possession of that firearm there at the airport, because people have gone to jail for doing that exact thing. You're going to have to work things out with the airline so that they keep your luggage there so that you don't take possession of that and become arrested in one of these very hostile anti-gun environments.
Yeah. The other thing is that, so you declare your firearm, the container gets whisked away, you get on your flight. Where do you pick up your firearm when you land at the other end at your destination?
Well, that's interesting. I've always just picked it up in my regular suitcase at the carousels. That's what's always happened to me. But I have read that the operations in some airports, because it's been tagged as having a firearm in it, you'll have to go like to the airline baggage person
department.
Department where like you'd go if something was lost. It's usually a little office over to the side from where the carousels are at. But in my case, speaking from personal experience, it always just shows up right there at the carousel.
Yeah.
One thing that I'm always cognizant of when I'm traveling with a firearm, because that's always been the case for me, I make sure I'm there at the carousel, and retrieve my luggage, because I don't want somebody, once again, maybe errantly, to pick up my suitcase that's got that firearm in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is another reason, by the way, to make sure your firearm is really securely stowed with those in those that Pelican case, and with that cable, as if somebody does take your bag, either intentionally or inadvertently, that firearm is secured.
Yeah. A couple of other points, just real quickly. With the locks, it's better to have a lock that fits the case relatively tightly, so that you don't have a lot of gap, so that the lock's not on it loosely, because that makes it easier to break off of the case.
Yeah, it makes it easier to break off, and then you can flip the levers up. I don't know if folks can see that. If the hasp is very big, then that gives you more room for the lid to kind of come up a little bit, where somebody could get something under and pry it. So, yeah.
Yeah, so you want to buy locks that should be difficult to pry, that fit tightly on the case that you've selected. The other thing, so we talked about guns and ammunition, but there are also rules for firearms parts, right? So this is really, I don't typically travel with separate parts, but a lot of people travel for competition, and sometimes take spare firing pins, spare springs, spare all sorts of things for their
magazines.
Magazines. All those things are subject to the same rules, and you have to declare those and have them in your checked baggage. They cannot be in your carry-on.
Yeah, I think, for instance, you can carry optics in your carry-on stuff, but you need to look at those things. Like I said, any parts or whatever, I would just put it all in the checked baggage is what I would do.
Yeah, exactly.
And by the way, I'll mention too, I carry pepper spray all the time, everywhere. And pepper spray, what do they call it? I don't know how they characterize it.
There's two different designations on the TSA website. There's a self-defense sprays, but they also have a pepper spray segment.
Yeah, but there's a fine there is up to $2,250 for bringing that to bring it to the checkpoint. So
you can travel with it, but it has to be in the checked luggage.
Yeah, and I have traveled with that as well, and I usually I put that in like a really thick Ziploc bag, and then it goes in another container by itself. So if something happens with pressure or heat, it won't affect anything.
I've never had this happen, but I would, like you said, put it in a Ziploc bag, so that if it does, for some reason, because of pressure changes, whatever, leak, you don't want it all over your luggage.
You don't want to cause an incident for other people or the airline or whatever. So mine goes in a Ziploc, and then I put it in another plastic container. So it's pretty much bomb proof.
Yeah.
At that juncture. And I will mention, for those of you that have silencers or suppressors, whatever terminology you want to use for those, that's something that, if you take it to I'm not talking about the legality of it in whatever jurisdiction you're in or whatever jurisdiction you're flying to, but just from a TSA perspective, those need to be in the checked baggage as well. And there are fines for that. There are fines for all kinds of things. You can go to the TSA website and look at all the ways that they have decided they can make money.
All right, Mike. Well, I think we've pretty much covered it. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we sort of recap and sign off here?
No, I think just folks need to take their time, look at the TSA website, look at the airline website, and don't get in a hurry.
Yeah, don't get in a hurry. So make sure you have it in your checked luggage, your firearm and your ammunition and any firearms parts. Make sure that you declare it at the check-in counter. When you go to the check-in counter, do not say, "I have a firearm." Say, I need to declare a firearm,
unloaded firearm.
An unloaded firearm. And do it in the most unintimidating and most polite and cooperative way possible. because you don't know who's at that check-in counter. They may be having a bad day. They may be afraid of guns. Do it in a very polite manner. Use a good solid case with a tight seal and good locks that fit the case. Like you said, Mike, know the airline rules as well as the TSA rules. Take care of this ahead of time with plenty of time at your house or hotel before you leave, because you don't want to rush through this process and get it wrong, because the civil penalty can be substantial and there could be a potential criminal referral.
Yeah, and I'll make one more comment. I think the TSA recommends this, and I think it's a good recommendation, is your checked bag, the one you're going to carry onto the airplane, pack an empty one, or at least empty the one you're going to carry. Because I think what happens is a lot of people, they use, like for me, for instance, I have a bag that has my laptop in it all the time. Now, if I put my gun in there and I never took it out, and that's where I carried it routinely, when I go to work all the time, I think people just forget that the stuff's in there. So empty your bag completely out, or just have another bag that you don't use except for traveling. So try to segregate your stuff. Start with an empty bag, empty it, do whatever to make sure you don't make a mistake. Have some process to go through.
Okay. All right, Mike. Well, I think that's where we'll leave it. Thanks again for joining the show. We'll be back on next week for Monday Gun Day. I'm not sure what we'll be talking about next week. I don't think we've decided on that quite yet. But I want to point people to, I haven't mentioned this much on the podcast, point people to our website. I post our podcast there with the link to the podcast in the video and the audio form. I also link to all of the resources that we talk about in these shows at the website. So it's easily accessible. You can search the website for this information. You can put in, once this is posted, you can put in flying with a firearm, and you'll have a link to all this information that we've talked about, the TSA regs, the Code of Federal Regulations, Greg Ellifrit's site, the Airlines websites with direct links to their policy about flying with a firearm. So please utilize the website for the resources, if nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, I always tell a lot of your listeners this is all old hat to them. They already know it, but it's a place where they can go and share information for people that don't know as much as they do maybe about these topics.
Yeah, exactly. So thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you learned something, got something useful out of it. Like I said, a lot of the stuff we talked about today was really best practices, not just minimal compliance with the TSA regs, but you can look at the TSA regs yourself to find out how you'd like to try to comply with those. But we've talked about primarily what we think people need to do as best practice to do that.
Or you could do what I do when I can't. I just drive.
Yeah, exactly.
And stay away. Yeah. I try to have as little interaction with federal authorities as possible.
Right. Yep. All right. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. That helps us spread the message of freedom. And until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter at Forge of Freedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.